Greetings, warriors and dreamers. Welcome to the realms of sleep, where tonight we journey through the epic world of God of War. I am your guide through the 9 realms, where ancient gods whisper their secrets and mythic landscapes unfold before us. From the frost-covered mountains of Midgard to the golden halls of Asgard, these tales of gods and giants will carry you into peaceful slumber. Lay down your weapons, rest your weary head, and allow the legends of these powerful beings to become the landscape of your dreams. The battles have been fought, and now is the time for rest. So close your eyes, brave one. Let the fire of the hearth warm you as we begin our journey through realms both wondrous and dangerous. The day had been long, filled with the familiar weight of training and hunting that had become the rhythm of Atreus's life. As twilight settled over the forest, he found himself drawn to a place that had become a sanctuary of sorts. A small clearing beside a creek where he and his father had made camp many times before. The journey back to their cabin would take another half-day's travel, and Kratos had decided they would rest here for the night, rather than push onward through darkness. Atreus sat on a moss-covered stone at the water's edge, his bow resting across his knees as he watched the last light of day filter through the canopy above. The creek burbled softly over smooth stones, its gentle voice a constant companion that seemed to speak in a language just beyond understanding. His father moved with deliberate purpose around their small camp, gathering wood for the night's fire, checking the perimeter with the habitual vigilance that never truly left him, even in familiar territory. "I'll set snares before full dark," Kratos said, his deep voice carrying easily across the clearing despite its low volume. "We may have fresh meat by morning." Atreus nodded, though his mind was elsewhere, drifting with the current of the stream, following its winding path through the forest and beyond. The day's exertions had left a pleasant tiredness in his limbs, a sensation he had come to appreciate rather than resist. It spoke of progress, of strength building upon itself day by day, hunt by hunt, just as his father had promised. "May I stay here a while?" he asked, gesturing toward the creek. "I like watching the water." Kratos studied his son for a moment, eyes seeing more than they revealed. "Stay within sight of camp," he finally answered. "Return when the fire is established." This was trust, measured and conditional, but trust nonetheless. Months earlier, such a request might have been met with immediate refusal. The gradual loosening of restrictions represented hard-won progress in their relationship, acknowledgement of Atreus' growing capability and judgment. As Kratos moved away to continue his preparations, Atreus turned his attention back to the creek. The water caught the fading light, transforming ordinary ripples into momentary flashes of gold and copper that appeared and vanished like fleeting thought. He found comfort in the water's constant movement, its endless journey from mountain heights to distant sea, changing form, but never truly beginning or ending, much like the stories Mimir often shared of cosmic cycles that extended beyond mortal comprehension. Mimir himself was unusually quiet this evening, having dozed off shortly after they had made camp. The head hung from Kratos' belt, his wooden features relaxed in an expression that mimicked sleep. Sometimes Atreus wondered what dreams might visit a consciousness housed in such an unusual vessel, whether Mimir revisited memories of his embodied existence, or journeyed to realms inaccessible to those still bound by flesh. The forest around him had begun its transition from day to night, diurnal creatures settling into nests and burrows as their nocturnal counterparts stirred to wakefulness. Birdsong faded, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl, or distant rustle of small mammals navigating the undergrowth. These sounds had once filled Atreus with unease, each representing potential threat or omen. Now he recognized them as simply the voice of the forest itself, neither malevolent nor benevolent, merely alive in its own complex way. He closed his eyes, allowing his other senses to expand into the space around him. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his nostrils, accompanied by the faint smoke from the fire Kratos had begun to build. The cool evening air brushed against his skin, carrying subtle changes in temperature that spoke of night's approach more clearly than any visual cue. Beneath it all ran the constant murmur of the creek, its voice changing subtly as it navigated around stones and fallen branches, creating a symphony of liquid notes that never quite repeated. When he opened his eyes again, the first stars had appeared in patches of visible sky above the clearing. They emerged gradually, pinpricks of ancient light piercing the deepening blue. Faye had taught him some of their names and stories, how certain configurations represented heroes and beasts whose tales had been carried through generations. Mimir knew even more, connecting each significant star to elaborate histories that spanned multiple realms and epochs. The fire at the center of their camp had caught properly now, its warm glow creating a circle of light that pushed back against the gathering darkness. Kratos moved around it with economical precision, arranging their minimal camp with the efficiency born of countless similar evenings. Soon he would expect Atreus to return, to take his place within that circle of warmth and relative safety. Yet something held the boy at the water's edge a moment longer, an intuition he couldn't quite name but had learned to respect. His mother had encouraged him to trust such feelings, explaining that they often emerged from observations his conscious mind hadn't fully processed. Kratos acknowledged them more reluctantly, his warrior's training having emphasized decisive action based on clear evidence rather than nebulous intuition. The feeling crystallized into awareness of subtle change in the forest's ambient sounds, not the approach of danger, but a shift in the night's expected patterns. Certain birds had fallen silent, small creatures had stilled their movements, creating a pocket of expectant quiet that centered around his position by the creek. Then he saw them, emerging from the deeper shadows beneath the trees on the opposite bank, two wolves moving with fluid grace that spoke of complete comfort in their surroundings. Their fur appeared silver grey in the dim light, neither purely white nor dark, but something between that seemed to capture moonlight even before the moon had fully risen. They moved without haste or apparent concern, approaching the creek directly across from where Atreus sat. His hand moved instinctively toward his bow before stilling halfway. These weren't ordinary wolves. At least, not in the way he had come to understand ordinary. There was a deliberate quality to their approach that spoke of purpose rather than chance encounter. They showed neither the caution of wild animals encountering human presence, nor the aggressive posture of predators assessing potential prey. The larger of the pair paused at the creek's edge, amber eyes fixed on Atreus with an intelligence that transcended animal awareness. Its companion stopped beside it, both now watching the boy with identical expressions of calm assessment. Neither made any move to cross the narrow waterway, instead settling onto their haunches, as if prepared to wait indefinitely for some sign or signal. Atreus remained perfectly still, caught in a moment that seemed somehow significant beyond immediate understanding. He had encountered wolves before, of course, hunted them when necessary, observed them from distance when hunting wasn't required. These felt different, in ways he couldn't immediately articulate, carrying an aura of purpose that ordinary beasts rarely displayed. Behind him, Kratos had noticed the visitors. Atreus could sense his father's immediate alertness, the subtle shift in energy that preceded potential conflict. Without turning, he raised his hand in a gesture they had established to indicate awareness without immediate threat. The tension across the clearing didn't dissipate entirely, but he knew his father would grant him momentary space to navigate this unusual encounter before intervening. "Hello?" Atreus said softly, the greeting emerging naturally despite no expectation of conventional response. "I won't harm you." The wolves' ears flickered forward at the sound of his voice, heads tilting slightly in mirrored movements that suggested communication between them. The larger one, perhaps the alpha of a small pack, made a soft sound low in its throat. Neither growl nor whine, but something between that carried distinct intention without aggression. Then, with deliberate movement that spoke of decision rather than impulse, both wolves rose and stepped into the creek. The water barely reached their chests at its deepest point, allowing them to cross with minimal effort, their eyes never leaving Atreus as they navigated the gentle current. He remained motionless, sensing that this moment required patience rather than action. When they emerged on his side of the creek, their fur darkened with moisture that caught the distant firelight in droplets resembling tiny stars. They approached without hesitation, circling once around the stone where he sat before settling on either side of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of their bodies against his legs. The behavior was so unexpected, so contrary to everything he understood about wild wolves, that Atreus found himself momentarily speechless. These creatures were behaving more like long-established companions than wild predators, encountering a human youth in the forest twilight. "Father," he called softly, knowing Kratos would be watching with increasing concern. "I think they're friendly." Kratos had moved to the edge of the camp, Leviathan axe in hand, though not raised in immediate threat. His expression combined caution with curiosity, unusual enough that Atreus noted it specifically. "They are not ordinary wolves," he stated, voice carrying the certainty of extensive experience with both mundane and supernatural creatures. "No," Atreus agreed, carefully lowering one hand to rest lightly on the nearest wolf's back. The animal permitted this contact without reaction, beyond a slight lean into his touch, its fur surprisingly soft beneath his fingers. "But I don't think they mean harm." The wolves seemed content in their chosen positions, settled beside the boy as if this arrangement had been predetermined. The larger one turned its amber gaze toward the night sky where stars continued emerging in ever greater numbers, while its companion watched the flowing creek with apparent interest in its endless movement. Mimir had awakened during this unusual development, his wooden features animated once more as he observed from his position at Kratos' belt. "Well now, this is rather fascinating," he commented, voice pitched to carry just far enough for Atreus to hear without startling the wolves. "You appear to have made some rather distinguished friends, lad." "Distinguished?" Atreus questioned, continuing to stroke the nearest wolf's fur with careful movements. "Indeed," Mimir replied with scholarly satisfaction. "If I'm not mistaken, and I rarely am about such matters, you're in the presence of law wolves. Quite rare these days, given Odin's systematic efforts to eliminate creatures with knowledge outside his control." The term was unfamiliar to Atreus, though it immediately evoked curiosity. "What are law wolves?" "Carriers of ancient wisdom," Mimir explained. "Unlike ordinary wolves, Magnificent creatures in their own right, of course. Law wolves maintain ancestral memories spanning generations. Some traditions hold that they serve as record keepers for experiences their kind collectively witnesses, preserving histories that might otherwise be lost. This explanation aligned with Atreus's intuitive sense that these visitors carried purpose beyond ordinary animal motivation. He studied them with renewed interest, noting subtle details he had initially overlooked. Patterns in their fur that resembled runes when viewed from certain angles. Eyes that seemed to hold depth beyond natural possibility. The deliberate quality of each movement suggesting consideration rather than instinct. "What do they want with me?" he asked, directing the question to Mimi while maintaining gentle contact with the wolf beside him. "Difficult to say with certainty," Mimir admitted. "Their motivations typically involve preservation or transmission of significant knowledge. Perhaps they've recognized something in you that resonates with their purpose. Your Jotnar heritage, possibly, or your developing connection to natural energies," Faye began nurturing. Kratos had maintained his vigilant position at the camp's edge, close enough to intervene if necessary while allowing this unusual interaction to unfold. "Are they dangerous?" he asked directly, practical concern overriding scholarly interest. "Not in the conventional sense," Mimi assured him. "Law wolves don't typically engage in ordinary predatory behavior. Their purpose centers around wisdom rather than hunting. That said, they're still physically wolves, with all the natural capabilities that entails." This assessment seemed to satisfy Kratos sufficiently to prevent immediate intervention, though Atreus knew his father would remain watchful throughout whatever might develop from this unexpected encounter. That vigilance had preserved them through countless dangers, its occasional excess a small price for continued survival in realms filled with both obvious and hidden threats. As twilight deepened toward true night, the wolves showed no inclination to depart. Their presence created a curious bubble of calm that extended beyond physical proximity, as if they carried peace with them as tangibly as their fur and flesh. Atreus found his earlier weariness transforming into tranquil contentment, muscles relaxing while mind remained clear and present. "The fire is ready," Kratos noted, after several minutes of this unusual tableau. "You should eat before rest." Ordinarily, Atreus would have immediately complied with this practical direction. Tonight, however, he felt reluctance to disturb the moment's strange harmony. "Could I eat here instead?" he asked, knowing such requests usually met with denial based on practical concerns about proper vigilance during vulnerable activities like eating or sleeping. Kratos considered this with characteristic thoroughness, weighing established protocol against unusual circumstances. Finally, he gave a single nod before retrieving a portion of their travel provisions: dried meat, hard bread, and a small pouch of preserved berries. He approached carefully, movements deliberately non-threatening as he placed the food within Atreus' reach without disturbing the wolves. "Thank you," Atreus said, genuine appreciation in his voice. These small accommodations represented significant adjustment in his father's rigid behavioral framework, changes that would have seemed impossible months earlier, when their journey together had just begun. As he ate his simple meal, the wolves remained beside him, occasionally turning their attention toward the food but making no move to request sharing. Their behavior maintained that unusual quality of deliberate restraint that separated them from ordinary animals, reinforcing Mimir's identification of their special nature. The moon had risen fully now, its silver light filtering through breaks in the forest canopy to create dappled patterns across the clearing. The creek caught and magnified this illumination, transforming ordinary water into flowing quicksilver that added its soft radiance to the warmer glow of their campfire. Night birds called occasionally from distant branches, their voices carrying clear messages to those who knew how to interpret such communications. When Atreus had finished eating, he found himself reluctant to return to the camp, despite growing awareness of night's deepening chill. Something held him at the water's edge, some unspoken potential in this strange communion with creatures Mimir had identified as keepers of ancient wisdom. His father had retreated to the fire's circle, but maintained obvious awareness of his son's position, respecting the moment's unusual nature while remaining prepared for any sudden change. The larger wolf stirred beside him, rising to a sitting position that brought its head level with Atreus' own as he remained seated on the moss-covered stone. Amber eyes met his directly, conveying unmistakable intelligence without revealing specific intention. Then, with deliberate movement that carried ceremonial quality, it lifted its muzzle toward the star-filled sky and released a sound unlike ordinary wolf vocalization. The sound began low, almost beneath the threshold of hearing, gradually rising into audible range with harmonic complexity that ordinary animal calls rarely achieved. Not quite song in human terms, yet far more melodically structured than typical howling. It seemed to weave the night sounds of the forest, water's murmur, wind's whisper, distant owl calls, into coherent expression that transcended individual components. Its companion joined moments later, adding complementary tones that intertwined with the first voice, creating resonance that seemed to vibrate through air and earth alike. Together, they produced what Atreus could only interpret as deliberate music, a lullaby of sorts, though unlike any he had heard in human settlements during their brief visits to populated areas. "What are they doing?" he whispered, not expecting specific answer, yet needing to acknowledge the extraordinary nature of what was unfolding around him. "Singing the law," Mimir replied softly, his typically animated voice subdued with evident respect. "It's how they preserve and transmit their collective wisdom. Through songs that contain ancestral memories encoded in specific tonal patterns. Few humans ever witness this, let alone receive it as direct communication." "They're singing to me?" Atreus clarified, wonder evident in his voice. "So it would appear," Mimir confirmed. "Quite the honor, really. Their songs typically remain within their own kind, shared only with those they deem worthy of carrying particular knowledge forward." The wolf's song continued, neither increasing in volume nor diminishing in complex beauty, maintaining perfect balance that allowed it to exist alongside, rather than dominate the night's natural symphony. As Atreus listened, he became aware of subtle patterns emerging within the seemingly continuous flow, rhythmic elements that reminded him of heartbeats and breathing, of running streams and swaying branches, of life's fundamental cycles expressed through sound. What began as external experience gradually shifted towards something more immersive, as if the music had found resonance within him that transcended ordinary hearing. Images began forming behind his closed eyelids, not sharp-edged visions but impressionistic glimpses of forests seen through different eyes, of mountains witnessed across changing seasons, of stars observed through countless nights stretching back through generations of watchful presence. These weren't his memories, nor even specific narratives he could easily articulate, but rather perspectives, ways of experiencing the world through senses arranged differently than human perception, interpreting reality through frameworks evolved for different purposes and priorities. The wolves were sharing not just what they had witnessed, but how they had witnessed it, offering glimpses into consciousness shaped by different evolutionary imperatives and social structures. Through this unusual communion, Atreus began understanding aspects of the forest he had previously observed only from outside, how sense created maps as vivid as visual landmarks, how subtle vibrations through earth conveyed information about distant movements, how starlight and moonlight revealed details invisible to daylight-adapted vision. The experience wasn't precisely knowledge in conventional terms, but rather expanded awareness, additional ways of interpreting what already existed. The lullaby continued, weaving these revelations into its complex structure, each harmonic shift introducing new perspective while maintaining connection to what had come before. There was teaching in this sharing, though not in forms he had encountered through Faye's patient instruction or Kratos' more direct training methods. This teaching emerged through experience itself, through momentary alignment with consciousness different enough from human awareness to offer genuinely novel viewpoint. Distantly, Atreus remained aware of his physical surroundings, the stone beneath him, the wolves beside him, his father's watchful presence nearby. Yet his primary focus had shifted toward this extraordinary communion, this sharing of perception that transcended ordinary communication barriers between species. He made no effort to analyze or categorize what he received, intuitively understanding that such analytical approach would diminish rather than enhance the experience. Within the wolf's song, he began detecting references to journeys, long migrations following ancient routes established by ancestors whose bones had long since returned to Earth from which they came. He glimpsed mountain passes navigated through generations, valleys where pack gatherings occurred during particular seasonal alignments, clearings where significant events had transpired that shaped collective memory. Not narrative history as humans might record it, but embodied remembrance carried through bloodlines and transmitted through songs like the one surrounding him now. More surprisingly, he caught occasional fragments that seemed to reference his own journey with Kratos, moments observed from distance by watchful presence he had never detected, their ascent of the mountain, encounters with various beings both helpful and hostile, quiet moments of connection beside campfires, not unlike the one burning nearby. The wolves had been witnessing portions of their path, tracking their progress through territory where they themselves had traveled for generations. This realization brought sudden understanding of this unexpected encounter's potential significance. These weren't random wolves who happened upon human travelers in shared forest territory. Their presence here, now, carried deliberate intention born of extended observation and collective decision. They had chosen this meeting, waiting for appropriate moment to reveal themselves and share whatever wisdom they deemed relevant to his particular journey. The song shifted subtly, harmonic structure adjusting to incorporate new elements that seemed oriented specifically toward Atreus himself, rather than general sharing of wolf perspective. These new patterns carried distinct emotional quality, not precisely encouragement in human terms, but recognition of journey undertaken and challenges faced, acknowledgement of growth already achieved and potential still developing. Through this musical communication, Atreus sensed connection beyond individual wolves now sitting beside him, linked to collective awareness that extended through time and space, encompassing generations of observers who had witnessed the rise and fall of human settlements, the coming and going of gods and other powerful entities, the enduring cycles of seasons and celestial movements that continued regardless of momentary disruptions in realms below. This larger perspective offered silent comfort regarding his own journey's uncertainties, contextualizing personal challenges within broader patterns that had repeated countless times through ages, extending beyond recorded history. Not diminishing individual experience's significance, but rather placing it within framework that allowed for both meaning and acceptance, for purpose without overwhelming burden of cosmic uniqueness. The lullaby's rhythm had gradually shifted as well, moving from initial complexity toward more soothing, repetitive patterns that invited deeper relaxation without demanding continued active attention. Like a mother's song to restless child, it offered safety within its gentle structure, permission to surrender vigilance temporarily, within protected space created through shared presence and mutual recognition. Atreus felt his eyelids growing heavy, the day's exertions combining with the wolves' hypnotic music to create overwhelming invitation toward rest. He resisted briefly out of ingrained habit. Atreus had emphasized importance of controlled transitions into vulnerability, of proper placement and protection before surrendering to sleep's necessary embrace. "Father," he called softly, voice barely carrying above the wolves' continuing song. "I'm getting very tired." Kratos had maintained his patient vigil throughout this unusual interaction, observing with combination of caution and curiosity that rarely manifested simultaneously in his typically decisive approach to unexpected developments. Now he moved closer, steps deliberately measured to avoid disrupting whatever communion had established itself between his son and these unusual visitors. "We should return to camp," he suggested, though with less insistence than typically characterized his practical directives. The wolves showed no alarm at his approach, their song continuing uninterrupted as they acknowledged his presence with brief glances before returning attention to their musical offering. This apparent acceptance seemed to influence Kratos' assessment of the situation, his habitual caution tempered by recognition of something beyond ordinary animal behavior. "Or perhaps," he amended, surprising both Atreus and himself with the adjustment, "we bring sleeping furs here instead." This unprecedented flexibility reflected significant evolution in his approach to parenthood. Willingness to adapt established protocols in response to unusual circumstances, rather than insisting on rigid adherence regardless of context. Months earlier, such accommodation would have been unthinkable, particularly regarding something as fundamental as sleeping arrangements in potentially vulnerable territory. "Thank you," Atreus said, genuine appreciation warming his voice. These small acknowledgments of his developing judgment and emerging connection to aspects of the world beyond Kratos' own experience represented hard-won progress in their relationship. With efficient movements born of countless similar evenings, Kratos retrieved their sleeping furs from the camp and arranged them near Atreus' position, close enough to the fire for necessary warmth without abandoning proximity to the wolves and creek that had become focal point for this unusual night. The arrangement satisfied both practical requirements for a relatively safe rest and respect for significant experience currently unfolding. As Atreus settled into his furs, the wolves adjusted their positions accordingly, maintaining their placement on either side without disrupting the continuous flow of their shared song. If anything, the lullaby seemed to deepen as he reclined, harmonic complexity becoming more subtle, while rhythmic elements grew more pronounced, adjustments that perfectly complemented transition from sitting alertness toward horizontal surrender to approaching sleep. Kratos positioned himself nearby, close enough for immediate response to potential threat, while granting sufficient space for this extraordinary communion to continue uninterrupted. His red-marked features revealed little of internal thought processes, yet Etre had learned to detect subtle indicators of his father's emotional state, the slight relaxation around eyes that suggested cautious acceptance, the minimal softening of typically rigid posture that indicated provisional trust in current circumstances. "Lad," Mimir spoke softly from his position now placed carefully on a nearby stone. "What you're experiencing is quite remarkable. The lore song is typically reserved for their own kind, or those they consider critical to preserving particular knowledge. Whatever they're sharing, consider it valuable beyond ordinary measure." Atreus nodded sleepily, already drifting toward boundaries where conscious thought began blending with approaching dreams. The wolf's song had created space where transition between these states occurred more gently than usual, without the stark separation that typically characterized movement from wakefulness to sleep. In this unusual twilight consciousness, he continued receiving impressions that weren't precisely thoughts or images, but rather complete sensory experiences. Moving through forest as member of cohesive social unit, feeling Earth's communication through paw pads, sensing air's complex information through olfactory awareness far beyond human capability. These experiences carried subtle guidance embedded within their structure, wisdom regarding balance between individual need and collective welfare, between immediate reaction and patient observation, between assertive action and strategic restraint. Not didactic lessons as humans might construct them, but embodied knowledge emerging from generations of successful navigation through constantly changing circumstances, where rigid patterns rarely served as effectively as adaptive response. As sleep approached more fully, the wolves' song seemed to expand beyond their physical presence, as if joined by distant voices carrying complementary melodies from forests and mountains beyond immediate surroundings. This harmonic expansion created an equivalent of stars appearing in night sky, individual lights combining into constellations that mapped meaningful patterns across apparently empty space. Within this expanding musical tapestry, Atreus detected references to his mother. Not direct communication about Faye specifically, but recognition of connection between her journeys and paths these wolves and their ancestors had witnessed through generations of observation. She had been known to them, acknowledged as significant presence whose movements they had noted with particular attention during her solitary travels through territories they considered within their awareness. This realization brought comfort of unexpected depth, confirmation that her existence had been witnessed and remembered by consciousness extending beyond human recognition or acknowledgement. While gods might manipulate histories for their own purposes, and humans might forget what extended beyond single generation's experience, these patient observers had carried her passing through their collective memory, preserving her significance within context larger than individual existence, yet more immediate than cosmic abstraction. Sleep continued its gentle approach, carried forward by the wolf's lullaby that had achieved perfect balance between engaging enough to hold attention and soothing enough to permit consciousness's gradual surrender. Atreus felt his thoughts becoming less structured, rational consideration giving way to associative drift that connected impressions without imposed narrative framework. The last images to form before dreams claimed him completely were of running through moonlit forest, not fleeing or pursuing, but simply moving, for joy of movement itself, feeling earth respond beneath his feet, air flowing around his body, stars holding steady above while trees and stones passed in rhythmic procession. Not memory of actual experience, but offered perspective. gift of perception from beings whose understanding of forest emerged from thousands of years of continuous presence within its changing yet consistent embrace. Throughout the night, the wolves maintained their vigil, their song continuing at lower volume but unbroken in its essential structure. Even in deepest sleep, some part of Atreus remained aware of this continuous offering, this sharing of perspective that worked its way into dreams to create experiences unlike any his unconscious mind typically generated from personal memory and imagination alone. He ran with pack members across territories whose boundaries existed in scent rather than visual markers, communicated through subtle body language more eloquent than spoken words could ever achieve, experienced seasonal changes as opportunities for adaptive response rather than obstacles requiring resistance. These weren't precisely his dreams, nor borrowed wolf experiences, but rather unique synthesis emerging from temporary communion between different consciousness types, sharing overlapping yet distinct realities. Kratos maintained his own form of vigilance throughout these night hours, resting in warrior's measured way that permitted necessary physical recuperation while maintaining peripheral awareness of surrounding environment. He observed the wolves with combination of caution and reluctant respect, recognizing something beyond ordinary animal nature in their behavior, without fully comprehending its specific significance. Mimir drifted in and out of his own version of sleep, occasionally opening carved wooden eyes to observe developments before returning to whatever passed for rest in his unique form of existence. His scholarly mind catalogued details for future reference, recognizing extraordinary nature of what transpired without interrupting its natural unfolding through excessive analysis or commentary. As night moved toward its deepest hours, the wolf's song achieved subtle transformation, shifting from sharing of perspective towards something closer to blessing or benediction, offering protection within sounds encompassing embrace. The clearing around them grew extraordinarily still, even ordinary nocturnal sounds temporarily suspended as if in respect for what transpired within this small space beside Creekbank, where different forms of consciousness had found temporary communion. When first light of approaching dawn began filtering through eastern trees, the wolves' song gradually diminished, not ending abruptly, but rather merging back into forest's ambient sounds, until indistinguishable from creek's murmur, wind's whisper, distant birds' awakening calls. This transition happened so smoothly that pinpointing precise moment of completion proved impossible, creating sense that the song hadn't actually ended, but rather transformed into different expression of same essential communication. Atreus woke feeling rested in way that transcended ordinary physical recuperation. His mind carried unusual clarity, thoughts flowing with coherence typically requiring considerable effort to achieve, particularly in morning's first moments. His body felt simultaneously relaxed and energized, as if having accessed restoration beyond what conventional sleep normally provided. The wolves were gone from their positions beside him, though he felt no surprise at this discovery. Their departure seemed appropriate completion to night's extraordinary communion, rather than abandonment or rejection. They had offered what they came to share, remaining precisely as long as that sharing required, without artificial extension beyond its natural conclusion. He sat up, looking around the clearing, now illuminated by dawn's gentle light. Kratos was already awake, of course, tending small fire while preparing simple morning meal from their provisions. Mimir too had returned to full alertness, wooden features animated with evident interest in discussing night's unusual developments. "Good morning," Atreus said, voice carrying contentment that reflected his unusually restful night. "Did you see when they left?" Kratos glanced up from his preparations, studying his son with a assessing gaze that had become a familiar component of their daily interactions. "Shortly before dawn," he answered. "They departed without disturbance. Quite extraordinary visitors," Mimir commented, scholarly enthusiasm evident in his tone. "In all my centuries of observation, I've witnessed lawwolves engage with humans perhaps 3 times previously, and never with such extended sharing as they offered you, lad." Atreus considered this as he rose from his sleeping furs, stretching muscles that felt unusually responsive after night's deep rest. "Why me, do you think?" he asked, genuine curiosity rather than self-importance motivating the question. "Several possibilities suggest themselves," Mimir replied thoughtfully. "Your Jotnar heritage certainly establishes potential resonance, as giants and lawwolves historically maintained respectful awareness of each other's territories and purposes. Your mother might have established specific connection during her travels, creating recognition they extended to her offspring." Kratos listened to this exchange while continuing practical morning preparations, his silence not indicating disinterest but rather typical restraint regarding matters extending beyond immediate tactical concerns. Yet Atreus noted subtle indicators of attention, slightly slowed head, marginally slowed movements, that suggested genuine consideration of topics he might previously have dismissed as irrelevant speculation. "There's something else," Atreus said slowly, attempting to articulate impression that had crystallized during his unusual night. "I think they've been watching us, watching our journey since it began. Not following exactly, but aware of where we've been, what we've encountered. Wouldn't surprise me in the slightest," Mimir confirmed. "Lawwolves maintain awareness of significant movements through their territories, particularly those with potential cosmic implications. Your journey certainly qualifies on that account, given its connections to prophecies and divine machinations." Approaching the creek where he had sat the previous evening, Atreus knelt to splash cold water on his face. Habitual morning ritual that helped transition from sleep's embrace toward day's demands. The water felt particularly refreshing this morning, each droplet seemingly carrying heightened sensory impact against his skin, as if his perceptual capacity had somehow expanded overnight. As he straightened, movement on the opposite bank caught his attention. Brief silver-grey flicker between trees that appeared and vanished too quickly for definitive identification. Perhaps merely trick of morning light through moving branches. Perhaps momentary glimpse of departing observers ensuring his safe awakening before continuing their own journey through territories humans rarely fully perceived, despite physical presence within them. "I think they're still watching," he commented, turning back toward camp with a smile that acknowledged this possibility without concern or resentment. Being witnessed by consciousness that extended beyond single lifespan or limited perspective seemed comforting rather than intrusive. Continuation of connection rather than unwelcome surveillance. Kratos made no direct response to this observation, though his gaze briefly scanned the forest edge before returning to immediate tasks. His acceptance of possibilities extending beyond empirical confirmation represented significant evolution in perspective that had initially rejected anything not directly observable or tactically relevant. As they broke camp after morning meal, preparing for final leg of journey toward home, Adrian found himself moving with unusual awareness of forest surrounding them. Scents carried greater information, Sounds revealed more precise locations. Subtle vibrations through Earth conveyed meaningful data about distant movement. Not dramatic transformation of senses, but rather enhanced attention to input his body had always received, without conscious registration. Legacy of nights spent in communion with consciousness that processed such information as primary rather than secondary awareness. "We should return here," he suggested, as they shouldered their packs, bows secured across his back, while Kratos adjusted Leviathan axe to its customary position. "Sometime soon, I mean. It feels like a good place." His father considered this request with characteristic thoroughness, weighing practical implications against less tangible factors that had gradually assumed greater significance in his decision-making process. "Perhaps," he allowed finally. Neither firm commitment nor outright rejection, but rather acknowledgement of possibility worth considering when circumstances permitted. For Atreus, this measured response represented significant victory. Recognition of value in connection beyond immediate practical necessity, acceptance that certain places might hold importance transcending tactical advantage or resource availability. Months earlier, such considerations would have been dismissed without discussion. Their current inclusion in assessment process demonstrated genuine evolution in their shared journey. As they departed the clearing, following familiar path that would lead eventually to their isolated cabin, Atreus carried with him not just restored physical energy, but expanded perspective. Temporary alignment with consciousness, different from his own, having created lasting impression that would continue informing how he experienced and interpreted the world around him. The wolf's lullaby remained with him as well. Not as specific melody he could reproduce or share, but as embodied memory that occasionally surfaced when certain combinations of natural sounds, running water, wind through leaves, distant animal calls, momentarily aligned to evoke its complex harmonics. In those brief moments, boundary between remembered experience and present perception temporarily dissolved, allowing reconnection with perspective that transcended individual existence without diminishing its significance. They walked in comfortable silence, father and son moving through forest with complementary awareness, Kratos scanning primarily for potential threats and practical concerns, Atreus now more attuned to subtler communications flowing constantly between elements comprising their surroundings. Not opposing approaches, but rather complementary perspectives, together creating more comprehensive understanding than either could achieve alone. The day stretched before them, filled with familiar rhythms of travel and training, hunting and survival that had become foundation of their shared existence. Yet beneath these external patterns ran deeper currents, gradual evolution of relationship, expanding awareness of connections extending beyond immediate circumstances, growing recognition of how individual journeys intersected with cosmic patterns without being entirely determined by them. From distant ridge came sound that might have been ordinary wolf call, announcing territory or signaling pack members, or perhaps final acknowledgement from extraordinary visitors who had shared night's communion beside Quiet Creek. Atreus smiled at this farewell, understanding that separation existed primarily in physical terms, rather than severing deeper connection established through shared experience and mutual recognition. The wolf's lullaby had offered more than temporary communion or passing comfort. It had provided a glimpse into perspective extending beyond single lifetime or limited consciousness, awareness that would continue informing his development long after specific memory of unusual night had faded into background of accumulated experience, not direct instruction as his parents had provided through different methods, but rather invitation into expanded understanding that each being must ultimately interpret and integrate according to individual journeys' particular requirements. As they continued homeward, Atreus found himself walking with slightly altered rhythm, not precisely mimicking Wolf's movement, but incorporating elements of its fluid efficiency into his own natural gait. Small adjustment representing larger integration, physical embodiment of perspective shared through night's extraordinary communion, not becoming something other than himself, but rather expanding definition of what that self might encompass through willing incorporation of wisdom offered from consciousness different yet complementary to his own. Kratos noted this subtle change without comment, his observant warrior's awareness registering modification without requiring explanation or justification. His own journey had demonstrated how encounters with different beings might influence without overwhelming, how expansion could occur without surrendering essential nature that defined individual existence within larger cosmic patterns. Above them, morning light filtered through forest canopy, creating dappled patterns across path leading homeward. Ahead lay familiar territory and continued journey, whose ultimate destination remained partially veiled, despite prophecies and visions offering fragmentary glimpses of possible futures. Behind them, clearing beside Quiet Creek held memory of unexpected communion that had temporarily bridged seemingly insurmountable differences between distinct forms of consciousness. The wolf's lullaby continued its subtle influence, working through dreams and quiet moments of reflection to reveal additional layers of meaning beyond initial sharing. Not singular message requiring immediate comprehension, but rather ongoing invitation into expanded perspective that would unfold gradually through continued journey whose significance extended beyond individual understanding while remaining anchored in personal experience. In this balance between individual and collective, between momentary and eternal, between practical necessity and cosmic purpose, Atreus continued finding his unique path, guided by father's hard-earned wisdom, mother's careful preparation, his own developing judgment, and occasional unexpected communion with consciousness, offering perspective beyond ordinary human limitations. The forest received them into its complex embrace, ancient trees standing witness to journeys unfolding beneath their spreading branches, some brief as single days' passage, others extending across generations, all contributing to ongoing story whose full pattern remained visible only from perspective transcending individual viewpoint, while honoring each thread's essential contribution to its gradually emerging design. In this balance between individual and collective, between momentary and eternal, between practical necessity and cosmic purpose, Atreus continued finding his unique path, guided by father's hard-earned wisdom, mother's careful preparation, his own developing judgment, and occasional unexpected communion with consciousness offering perspective beyond ordinary human limitations. The forest received them into its complex embrace, ancient trees standing witness to journeys unfolding beneath their spreading branches, some brief as single days' passage, others extending across generations, all contributing to ongoing story whose full pattern remained visible only from perspective transcending individual viewpoint, while honoring each thread's essential contribution to its gradually emerging design. The first stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky as Atreus settled beside the dying embers of their campfire. The day's long journey had left a pleasant weariness in his limbs, the kind that promised deep sleep rather than pain. He stretched his fingers toward the fading warmth, watching as the last flames danced over the blackened wood before surrendering to the encroaching night. His father, Kratos, sat some distance away on a fallen log, meticulously sharpening his axe with long, practiced strokes of a whetstone. The massive blade caught occasional glints of firelight, reflecting them like cold stars against its polished surface. The rhythmic scraping sound blended with the gentle chorus of night insects, and the occasional distant howl that echoed through the forest. These howls had been growing more frequent in recent days, wolves moving through their territory, following game, or perhaps simply announcing their presence to all who might listen. Their camp was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by ancient pines whose branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, creating a whispered conversation far above their heads. The air carried the rich scents of pine resin, earth, and the lingering aroma of the stew they had shared earlier. Rabbit caught by one of Atreus's arrows, flavored with wild herbs his mother had taught him to recognize on forest floors. Atreus tilted his head at a particularly clear howl that rang out across the valley. "They sound closer tonight," he observed, glancing toward his father. "The wolf pack." Kratos paused his work momentarily, his keen senses assessing the sound. "Yes," he confirmed, before resuming his methodical sharpening. "Moving north, following the deer herds." The boy nodded, pulling his fur cloak tighter around his shoulders against the evening chill. His thoughts drifted to the wolves whose voices carried through the darkness. Unlike the monstrous creatures they had encountered on their journeys, the nightmarish amalgamations of flesh and spirit driven by rage or hunger, these were natural predators. They killed to survive, moved with purpose, and lived by codes as ancient as the mountains themselves. "Mother used to tell me stories about wolves," Atreus said after a long silence, his voice soft with memory. "She said they were like us in many ways. They protect their families, hunt together, and face the winter as one." Kratos' hands stilled again, though his eyes remained fixed on the blade across his knees. These mentions of Fae always seemed to create a moment of suspension between them, a shared grief neither fully expressed nor entirely suppressed. "Your mother was wise in the ways of beasts," he said finally. "She understood their nature. She told me once that wolves don't waste words," Atreus continued, encouraged by his father's response. "That they communicate with glances, with the position of their ears and tails, with sounds too quiet for humans to hear. She said sometimes the strongest bonds don't need many words at all." A faint smile crossed the boy's face as he recalled her teaching him to observe the forest animals, how to read their movements and understand their silent language. It had been one of her gifts to him, this ability to see beyond the surface of things, to find meaning in silence. Kratos set aside his axe and whetstone, his massive frame silhouetted against the indigo sky. "Rest, boy," he said, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow's journey will be long." Atreus nodded and arranged his bedroll closer to the dying embers. The forest around them had grown quieter, as if the night creatures paused to listen to the distant wolf song that occasionally rose above the canopy. The boy settled onto his back, gazing up at the stars that were now scattered across the vast darkness above. As sleep began to claim him, Atreus found his thoughts drifting with the wolf howls. In that space between wakefulness and dreams, he imagined himself walking alongside the silent pack, moving through moonlit woods, guided only by instinct and the ancient wisdom that flows through all living things. The first light of false dawn cast the forest in shades of silver and blue when Atreus found himself standing at the edge of a clearing he did not recognize. The trees here were ancient, their massive trunks gnarled with age, their branches reaching toward a sky still adorned with fading stars. Around him, the forest breathed with the deep rhythms of night transitioning to day. Dew gathering on leaves, nocturnal creatures returning to their dens, early birds stirring but not yet singing. Atreus knew with the peculiar certainty that comes in dreams that he was alone yet not alone. His father was absent, their camp nowhere to be seen, but he felt no fear. Instead, there was a sense of anticipation, as if he had been invited to witness something few ever saw. Movement at the clearing's edge drew his attention. A wolf stepped from between the trees, large and grey, with amber eyes that regarded him without hostility or fear. The animal paused, its breath visible in the cool air, and then slowly inclined its head as if in greeting or invitation. More shapes materialized from the forest shadows. First one, then three, then 7 wolves in total, moving with fluid grace as they encircled the clearing. Their coats varied from silver grey to deep charcoal, their eyes reflecting the pre-dawn light. They made no sound, not even the soft pad of paws on the forest floor, creating an atmosphere of reverent silence. The first wolf, clearly the leader, approached Atreus directly. Standing before the boy, it was massive, its shoulder reaching Atreus's chest, its presence commanding respect without demanding fear. Up close, Atreus could see the complexity in the animal's gaze, intelligence, curiosity, and something that seemed almost like recognition. Without thinking, Atreus extended his hand palm down, fingers relaxed, just as his mother had taught him when approaching the hunting dogs that sometimes accompanied travelers through their woods. The wolf leaned forward, its muzzle nearly touching the boy's fingertips. Atreus felt the warm breath against his skin, saw the subtle shift in the animal's posture that signaled acceptance. The wolf stepped back, then turned and moved toward the far side of the clearing. After a few paces, it paused and looked back at Atreus with unmistakable expectation. "You want me to follow?" Atreus whispered, understanding flowing between them without need for words. The rest of the pack had already begun to move, forming a loose formation that left a space, a place for him. With a deep breath, Atreus stepped forward, joining their silent procession as they entered the forest on the clearing's opposite side. They moved as one, the pack and the boy, through terrain that would have been challenging in daylight, yet seemed to open before them in the pre-dawn darkness. Ancient trees gave way to younger growth, dense thickets parted to reveal hidden game trails, and fallen logs became natural bridges over small ravines. Throughout it all, the wolves maintained their silence, communicating through subtle shifts in position, through ears that swiveled to catch distant sounds, through tails that signaled caution or confidence. Atreus found himself adapting to their silent language with surprising ease, as if awakening knowledge long dormant within him. When the lead wolf paused, he stopped instantly. When the pack spread out to navigate a rocky slope, he naturally found his place in their formation. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just the fluid coordination of beings who understood their place within a greater whole. As they traveled, Atreus observed how the wolves moved, not wasting energy, choosing each step with purpose, conserving strength for when it might be truly needed. He recognized in their economy of movement the same principles his father had taught him about survival in the harsh northern lands. Nothing was without purpose. Nothing was done for show. Every action served life, served the pack, served the journey. The sky had begun to lighten, the stars fading as indigo deepened toward the purple pink of approaching sunrise. In this growing light, Atreus could better see his companions. The wolves were not the mangy, desperate creatures that sometimes troubled villages during harsh winters. These animals were in their prime, muscles rippling beneath thick coats, eyes clear and alert, movements confident and assured. The lead wolf, whom Atreus had begun to think of as the pathfinder, occasionally glanced back, not to check if the boy followed, but almost as if confirming that he understood what was being shared through this journey. There was teaching happening in this silent trek, Atreus realized. Not with words or demonstrations, but through participation in something ancient and true. He studied the pathfinder's movements with quiet fascination. The wolf moved with an economy that seemed almost artful, each step placed with precision, each turn of the head serving a purpose, each pause containing information for those who knew how to interpret it. There was nothing wasted in these motions, nothing done for appearance rather than function. Yet this pure utility achieved its own kind of beauty, like a perfectly carved bow or a well-balanced knife. Atreus remembered watching his mother move through the forest in much the same way, with awareness that bordered on communion with their surroundings. She could read the language of bent twigs, of disturbed earth, of shifted stones, in ways that had seemed magical to him as a younger child. Now, walking with the wolves, he began to understand that what had appeared supernatural was simply deep attention, the result of generations of knowledge passed down and perfected through necessity and respect. The boy adjusted his own movements, consciously at first and then with growing naturalness. He began to place his feet more carefully, to scan his surroundings in the rhythmic pattern the wolves employed, to feel the subtle changes in air currents against his skin that might carry scents or sounds from beyond immediate perception. They came to a small stream, its water clear and swift over stones polished by centuries of flow. Without pause, the wolves stepped into the cold current, crossing at a shallow point with deliberate steps. Atreus followed, feeling the icy water through his boots, but noticing how the wolves had chosen a crossing that minimized both depth and the force of the current, the safest, most efficient path. On the opposite bank, Atreus observed how the pack paused momentarily, several members drinking quickly before continuing. The boy knelt and cupped his hands, bringing the sweet, cold water to his lips. It tasted of mountains and stone, of distances traveled and places yet unseen. As he stood, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, Atreus realized that the forest had changed subtly during their crossing. The trees here were more widely spaced, their trunks straight and tall, reaching toward light rather than competing for it. The undergrowth was sparser, consisting of ferns and small flowering plants rather than the tangled briars they had navigated earlier. "We've crossed into a different part of the forest," he murmured, more to himself than to his silent companions. The pathfinder turned its amber gaze toward him, and Atreus felt that strange sense of understanding pass between them again. Boundaries existed everywhere in the natural world, between territories, between seasons, between life stages. Crossing them was necessary for growth, for survival, for knowledge. The wolf seemed to acknowledge his observation with a slight lowering of its massive head before turning to continue their journey. They traveled through this more open woodland as the sky brightened further, dawn approaching with each passing moment. Birdsong had begun to fill the air, first the solitary call of an early riser, then a duet, then a chorus as more joined the greeting of the new day. The wolves moved through this growing symphony as silent counterpoints, their paws making almost no sound on the soft forest floor. Atreus noticed how his own footfalls seemed louder in comparison, despite his best efforts to move quietly as his mother had taught him. He began to adjust his steps, placing his feet more deliberately, rolling from heel to toe with careful precision. With each adjusted step, he found himself moving more silently, more efficiently, more like his companions. And the pack's formation shifted occasionally as they traveled. Wolves moving from the periphery to the center, others taking up boundary positions, all without apparent command or discussion. Atreus observed that these changes weren't random, but responsive to the terrain and to subtle cues he was just beginning to perceive. A scent on the breeze, a distant sound, perhaps even the angle of the strengthening sunlight filtering through the canopy. When they passed near a grove of berry bushes, two younger wolves diverted briefly to investigate, rejoining the pack moments later. When a fallen tree blocked their direct path, the group naturally flowed around the obstacle before reforming their previous arrangement. When they approached a small meadow, the formation tightened, wolves drawing closer together before entering the more exposed space. Throughout it all, Atreus found his place instinctively, moving with rather than among them. He was neither leader nor follower, but a part of something greater, a temporary but authentic member of their silent community. The experience carried none of the tension or uncertainty that often accompanied his interactions with strangers, or even with his father. Here was acceptance without condition, belonging without demand. As the first direct rays of sunlight began to pierce the forest canopy, creating dappled patterns on the ground before them, the wolves led Atreus up a gentle slope covered with soft moss and scattered wildflowers. At its crest, the trees opened to reveal a natural overlook, a flat, stone platform extending from the hillside that offered an unobstructed view of the valley below. The Pathfinder moved to the edge of this natural balcony and sat, its posture regal against the backdrop of mountains and forests stretching to the horizon. The other wolves arranged themselves nearby, some sitting, others standing, all facing the spectacular vista as the rising sun painted the landscape in gold and amber tones. Atreus took his place beside the Pathfinder, settling on the sun-warmed stone with his legs crossed. From this vantage point, he could see for miles, forests giving way to meadows, meadows rising to foothills, foothills building toward distant mountains, whose peaks still held the previous winter's snow. A river wound through it all, glinting silver in the morning light. "It's beautiful," he whispered, the words emerging despite his adaptation to the pack's silence. The Pathfinder's ear twitched at the sound, but made no other acknowledgement. The wolf's gaze remained fixed on the panorama, its attention seemingly absorbed by something beyond the mere visual splendor. Atreus followed the wolf's line of sight, trying to see what it saw. At first, he noticed only the grand scale of the landscape, the sweep of forest, the majesty of mountains. Then, as he continued to look, smaller details began to emerge. The movement of deer at a forest edge, birds circling above a distant clearing, the subtle shift of shadows as the sun continued its ascent. But the wolf was seeing something more, Atreus realized, something beyond physical features. It was seeing the land as a living whole, with patterns and connections invisible to casual observation. The territories and pathways, the sources of water and shelter, the places of danger and safety, All existed in a complex web that the wolf perceived intuitively. As this understanding dawned, Atreus felt a shift in his own perception. The landscape before him was no longer simply scenery to be admired, but a text to be read, a story written in the language of nature. He began to see how the river shaped not just the physical contours of the land, but the movements of all creatures within it. How the prevailing winds influenced the growth of trees, creating natural corridors through the forest. How the cycle of seasons was written in the varying shades of green that carpeted the valleys and hillsides. The wolves sat in silent contemplation of this living map, and Atreus joined them, absorbing the wisdom offered through simple observation. Time seemed to suspend itself as they shared this moment of quiet communion with the world spread before them. Eventually the pathfinder rose, stretching briefly before turning back toward the forest. The other wolves followed suit, their break concluded, their journey resuming. Atreus stood as well, casting one last glance at the impressive vista before following his companions into the shelter of the trees. Their path now led downward, following game trails that wound through increasingly lush vegetation. The morning sun had risen fully, warming the air and bringing forth the rich scents of earth and growing things. Butterflies fluttered between patches of wildflowers, and bees hummed their industrious song as they gathered nectar. The pack moved with the same deliberate grace as before, though Atreus noticed subtle changes in their formation. They traveled more widely spaced now, covering more ground with their senses. Occasionally, one would pause to investigate a scent or sound before rejoining the group, maintaining the collective awareness that was their strength. Atreus found himself increasingly attuned to these silent communications. He began to recognize the meaning in a raised hackle, in the angle of an ear, in the position of a tail. More remarkably, he realized that the wolves had begun to read his signals as well, responding to his pauses, accommodating his pace, acknowledging his observations of interesting or unusual things along their path. They came to a place where the forest had been touched by fire some seasons past. Blackened tree trunks stood like sentinels among vibrant new growth. Saplings pushing upward toward sunlight, flowering plants blooming in profusion, berry bushes laden with fruit. Life reclaiming space with tenacious determination. The contrast between destruction and renewal was stark yet beautiful. Atreus could see how the fire had cleared space for new beginnings, how what must have seemed like devastation had created opportunity for different forms of life to flourish. There was wisdom in this cycle, not comfort perhaps, but truth about how the world renewed itself through necessary endings. He thought of his mother then, of the pyre that had transformed her physical form to ash and smoke, of how her passing, painful as it remained, had set in motion their journey, had created space for new understanding between father and son, had opened pathways that might otherwise have remained hidden. The thought brought no less grief, but perhaps a different perspective on its place within larger patterns. The pack paused here, several wolves moving toward the berry bushes to feed on the ripe fruit. Atreus followed their example, picking handfuls of sweet berries that stained his fingers purple. The burst of flavor against his tongue was intense, tart and sweet simultaneously, carrying the concentrated essence of sunlight absorbed through leaves, transformed into nourishment. He watched as the wolves ate with efficient enjoyment, taking what they needed without waste or excess. When they had finished, they moved on without lingering. Another lesson in the flow of their existence. Beyond the burn area, the forest changed character again. Here grew the ancient giants of the northern woods, massive pines and firs that had stood for centuries, their trunks so large that Atreus could not have encircled them with his arms. The canopy high above created a cathedral-like space beneath, where light filtered through in distinct beams that illuminated the forest floor in scattered pools. The pack's movements slowed in this sacred space, their steps taking on an almost reverent quality. Idris felt it too, the sense of entering somewhere timeless, a place where the normal boundaries between past and present, between sleeping and waking, seemed more permeable. The wolves led him to a small clearing at the center of this ancient grove. Unlike the burn area's chaotic abundance, this space possessed an ordered serenity. Ferns growing in perfect circles, moss covering fallen logs with velvet precision, wildflowers arranged as if by deliberate design. At the clearing's heart stood a single stone, not large, but unmistakably placed by human hands in the distant past. The pathfinder approached this stone and sat beside it, amber eyes fixing on Atreus with clear expectation. The other wolves arranged themselves around the perimeter of the clearing, creating a living boundary that was not containment but protection, ensuring that this moment would unfold without interruption. Atreus moved toward the stone with instinctive respect. Up close, he could see that its surface bore carvings, simple but unmistakable representations of wolves, humans, trees, and stars, arranged in patterns that suggested connection rather than separation. His fingers traced these ancient markings, feeling the indentations made by tools wielded by hands long since returned to dust. He somehow understood, he whispered, looking up at the pathfinder. Whoever made this, they knew what you were showing me. The wolf's gaze remained steady, neither confirming nor denying, simply witnessing the boy's discovery. Around the clearing, the other wolves maintained their silent vigil, their presence reinforcing the significance of this moment. Atreus settled on the ground before the stone, crossing his legs and resting his hands on his knees in unconscious imitation of how he had seen his mother sit during her quieter moments of contemplation. The carvings before him began to arrange themselves into patterns that made a different kind of sense, not as pictures, but as a story, a teaching passed down through generations. The images showed humans and wolves moving together through forests, over mountains, beneath stars, not as master and servant, not as hunter and hunted, but as companions, sharing knowledge and protection. The ancient carver had understood what Atreus was now learning. That wisdom could flow between all living things when they moved beyond fear and dominance. His father had taught him strength, how to survive in a harsh world, how to face enemies, how to endure. His mother had taught him observation, how to read signs, how to listen to the quiet voices of nature, how to perceive what lay beneath surfaces. Both were necessary teachings. Both had prepared him for his journey, but the wolves were teaching him something else, something about silent communion, about moving through the world as part of it rather than against it, about the strength found in belonging. This was knowledge not passed through words or demonstrations, but through shared experience, through participation in ancient patterns. Atreus closed his eyes, allowing these realizations to settle within him. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his father, strong but often isolated by his own nature. He saw his mother, connected to the world around her in ways Kratos might never fully understand. And he saw himself, carrying both legacies, both strengths, both perspectives. The boy felt the warm stone beneath him, solid and reassuring against his palms. He heard the gentle breathing of the wolves around him, the soft rustling of leaves overhead, the distant call of a bird soaring above the canopy. He smelled the rich earth, the sweet decay of fallen leaves, the subtle musk of the wolves themselves. In this moment of sensory awareness, he felt more fully present than he had in many days of their actual travels. The world often demanded action, quick responses, decisive movements, immediate choices. His journey with his father had been filled with such moments, where survival depended on speed and strength and skill. Those lessons were necessary, especially in a world populated by dangers both mundane and mythical. But what the wolves offered was different. The wisdom of knowing when to be still, when to observe, when to simply be present within the moment. Atreus thought of his father's constant vigilance, his readiness for threat that never fully subsided. He thought of his mother's quiet moments of contemplation, how she would sometimes sit for hours, watching the patterns of light through leaves or the movement of clouds across the sky. Two approaches to a dangerous world, both valid, both offering protection of different kind. The wolves seemed to embody something between these extremes, fully alert to their surroundings, yet not consumed by wariness, capable of rest without surrendering awareness, strong without needing to demonstrate their strength. Their power lay partly in their connection to each other, in the multiplied awareness that came from moving as one entity composed of separate beings. The boy opened his eyes to find the Pathfinder still watching him, its gaze reflecting neither judgment nor impatience, but simple acceptance. Around the clearing, the other wolves maintained their positions, some alert, others resting, all part of the circle that had temporarily included him. With a sense of completion rather than conclusion, Atreus rose to his feet. The lesson of this place had been received, though he suspected its full meaning would continue to unfold within him for many days to come. He inclined his head toward the stone in respect for those who had come before, then turned his attention back to the Pathfinder, ready to continue their journey. The wolf rose with fluid grace and led the way out of the clearing, the others falling into formation around them as they had before. They moved deeper into the ancient forest, where the trees grew even larger and more widely spaced, creating an environment that felt both vast and intimate simultaneously. Sunlight had reached its zenith, filtering through the canopy to create a green-gold illumination that seemed to pulse with the forest's breathing. The air here felt different, richer somehow, as if carrying the accumulated oxygen of centuries of growth. Atreus found himself taking deeper breaths, feeling lightheaded in the most pleasant way as his body adjusted to this concentrated life force. The wolves seemed affected as well, their movements taking on an almost playful quality despite their continued silence. They wove between the massive tree trunks with graceful precision, occasionally breaking formation to investigate interesting scents or sounds before returning to the group. Even the Pathfinder seemed less solemn, its tail held higher, its pace more buoyant. Atreus found his own steps lightening, his awareness sharpening further. Colors appeared more vivid, scents more distinct, sounds clearer and more nuanced. It was as if the ancient forest had heightened all his senses, bringing him into more complete presence within the moment. They came to a place where a massive tree had fallen, perhaps decades earlier, creating a natural corridor through the forest. Its enormous trunk, now covered with moss and sprouting saplings from its decaying wood, stretched for many yards before them. Without hesitation, the Pathfinder leapt atop this natural bridge, and the other wolves followed, balancing easily on its broad surface. Atreus joined them, finding the moss-covered bark providing surprisingly secure footing. They proceeded along this elevated pathway, giving the boy a different perspective on the forest around them. From this height, modest compared to the soaring canopy, but significantly above the forest floor, he could see patterns in the undergrowth that wouldn't be visible from ground level. The fallen giant had created its own ecosystem in death. Nursed log to countless new lives, highway for small creatures, shelter for those who made homes beneath its protective bulk. Nothing wasted, everything transformed. Another silent lesson offered to those with eyes to see. At the log's end, they descended to a place where the ground sloped gently toward the sound of running water. Following game trails worn smooth by centuries of use, the pack led Atreus to the bank of a stream larger than the one they had crossed earlier. Its waters ran clear and swift over a bed of smooth stones in countless shades of grey, brown, and rust red. Without prompting, several wolves moved to the water's edge to drink. Others patrolled the perimeter, maintaining the group's security, even in this moment of vulnerability. The Pathfinder paused beside a large boulder at the stream's edge, sitting in a patch of dappled sunlight that made its grey coat glow silver. Atreus approached the water, kneeling to drink as he had at the previous crossing. The taste was different here, still fresh and sweet, but with mineral notes that spoke of deeper earth, older stone. He splashed some on his face, enjoying the cool shock against skin warmed by their journey. The water's surface reflected fractured images, clouds drifting overhead, branches swaying, his own face looking back at him with an expression more peaceful than he could remember seeing in his own reflection for some time. The boy who gazed back seemed subtly changed from the one who had followed the Pathfinder from the clearing at dawn. Not older exactly, but perhaps more settled within himself. As the ripples from his touch dispersed, Atreus watched how the stream's current created patterns across its surface. Swirls and eddies, smooth glides and turbulent riffles. Each variation resulted from what lay beneath. Rocks, fallen branches, shifts in the stream bed, invisible influences shaping visible results. The water did not fight these obstacles, but flowed around and over them, adapting continuously without losing its essential nature. The sound of the water created its own kind of silence, a consistent, gentle rushing that absorbed other noises and created space for thought. Atreus had noticed how his father sometimes sought out such places during their travels, standing beside waterfalls or rapids with an expression that, if not peaceful, at least suggested momentary respite from whatever burdens he carried. Perhaps the constancy of moving water offered something steady in a world where little else remained unchanged. When he had refreshed himself, Atreus moved to sit near the Pathfinder, drawn by an inexplicable sense that another teaching awaited. The wolf acknowledged his presence with a slight turn of its massive head, but continued gazing at the flowing water before them. Atreus followed this gaze, trying again to see what his companion saw. The stream moved with hypnotic constancy, always changing in its details, yet unchanging in its essential nature. Individual droplets passed, never to return, yet the stream itself remained. There was profound truth in this simple observation, though Atreus couldn't have articulated it in words. As they sat in shared contemplation, Atreus became aware of subtle movements upstream and downstream. Other forest creatures coming to drink. A family of deer approached cautiously from the opposite bank, eyes and ears alert for danger. Small birds flitted between branches overhanging the water, occasionally diving to capture insects dancing above the surface. Even a fox appeared briefly, its russet coat vivid against the greenery before it vanished back into the underbrush. The wolves made no move toward these potential prey, and the creatures, while cautious, showed no panic at the predator's presence. There seemed to be an unspoken agreement here, a temporary truce around the shared resource of water. Another kind of silent understanding, another form of natural wisdom. Atreus realized that the pack could have hunted at any point during their journey. They had passed game trails, had likely scented prey nearby, had the strength and skill to bring down substantial quarry, yet they had not done so. This journey was not about hunting, but about showing, about teaching through presence, rather than through action or instruction. The Pathfinder rose eventually, shaking water droplets from its coat before moving upstream along the bank. The others followed, and Atreus joined them, noting how they now traveled single file along the narrow space between water and forest. Their pace was unhurried, yet purposeful, as if approaching a destination of significance. The stream led them to a place where the land opened unexpectedly, the ancient forest giving way to a meadow filled with tall grasses and wildflowers swaying in a gentle breeze. Beyond this open space, mountains rose blue-gray against the sky, their peaks still distant, but more distinct than they had appeared from the earlier overlook. The wolves paused at the forest's edge, seemingly reluctant to enter the exposed meadow despite the absence of obvious threats. Atreus understood their hesitation. Open spaces meant visibility, but also vulnerability, especially in daylight. Yet there was something inviting about the sun-warmed grasses and colourful blooms that stood in such contrast to the forest's green solemnity. After a moment's consideration, the Pathfinder stepped forward into the meadow, the others following with greater space between them, spreading out to maintain awareness across this more open terrain. Atreus moved with them, feeling the transition from soft forest loam to the springier footing of meadow soil beneath stands of grass that reached nearly to his waist. They traveled through this golden green sea with the same quiet efficiency they had shown in the forest, though Atreus noticed how the wolves occasionally paused to scent the wind that moved more freely here than beneath the trees. Birds circled high above, their keen eyes surely noting the unusual procession below. At the meadow's center stood another stone, larger than the one in the forest clearing and bearing no visible markings. Yet there was unmistakable purpose in its placement, rising from the grasses like a silent sentinel. The pack converged on this marker, arranging themselves around it in a formation that left a space for Atreus. As he approached, Atreus felt a strange familiarity, not with the stone itself, but with the feeling it evoked. There was power here, not ostentatious or threatening, but deep and quiet, like still water that reflects the sky. He took his place in the circle, standing beside the Pathfinder as the afternoon sun warmed the stone and the wolves and the boy who had walked with them. The wind moved through the meadow grasses in visible waves, creating patterns like water flowing across the land. The sensation against Atreus's skin was gentle but constant, the world's breath, his mother had called it once. The unseen force that connected mountain to valley, forest to plain, sky to earth. It carried scents from distant places, a hint of snow from the mountain peaks, traces of blossoms from meadows beyond their vision, the faint mineral tang of stone warmed by sunlight. Overhead, Clouds drifted in slow procession across the vast blue expanse, their shadows moving across the landscape like silent companions to their journey. Birds circled on thermal currents, rising and falling without visible effort, masters of an element humans could only briefly visit but never inhabit. The boundary between earth and sky seemed both absolute and permeable, a paradox that somehow made perfect sense in this moment of clarity. Atreus felt the ground solid beneath his feet, the connection running from soil through his body to the air above. He sensed the presence of the wolves around him, their quiet strength, their communal awareness, their acceptance of his temporary place among them. For a moment, the artificial separation between self and world, between human and animal, between observer and observed, seemed to dissolve, replaced by recognition of a deeper unity underlying apparent divisions. In this moment of stillness, surrounded by silent companions, Atreus felt connections extending outward like invisible threads. To the forest behind them, to the mountains before them, to the sky above and the earth below, to his father's strength and his mother's wisdom, to all he had been and all he might become. The Pathfinder turned its amber gaze toward him, and in those eyes Atreus saw acknowledgement. Of the journey shared, of the teachings offered, of the understanding reached without words. There was also something like farewell, though not the permanent kind. Rather, it was recognition that paths that had converged must eventually diverge again, each continuing its own necessary journey. The wolf's eyes reflected both wisdom and wildness, the accumulated knowledge of generations combined with the essential freedom that defined its nature. Atreus saw in that gaze neither sentimentality nor detachment, but clear-eyed acceptance of the world's patterns. Meetings and partings, sharings and separations, all forming the complex weave of existence. A memory surfaced of his mother telling him how wolves might temporarily adopt animals of other species, even those that might typically be prey, under certain circumstances. Not from confused instinct, but from something that, while different from human compassion, served similar purpose in maintaining life's intricate balance. The boundaries between protector and predator, between companion and hunter, were not always as fixed as they might appear. Atreus thought of his father's initial reluctance to bring him on their journey, of how that protective impulse had gradually shifted to allow for growing partnership. There had been no dramatic moment of transformation, but rather incremental adjustments. Kratos seeing his son not just as responsibility, but as developing ally. Atreus proving his worth not through words but through actions. Like his journey with the wolves, their relationship had evolved through shared experience rather than declaration. To Atreus nodded, accepting this truth without sadness. What had been shared would remain, carried forward in memory and in changed perception. The wisdom of the silent pack would continue to unfold within him long after their physical presence had gone. The wolves began to move again, continuing across the meadow toward the distant mountains. But this time, the Pathfinder paused after a few steps, looking back at the trees with clear expectation. The boy understood. His place was no longer with the pack. Their paths separated here, though the connection forged would endure. "Thank you," Atreus said simply, the words carrying all he could not express about what this journey had meant to him. The Pathfinder held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and continued forward, the others flowing around their leader like water around stone. Atreus watched them go, their grey forms gradually diminishing against the landscape but never truly vanishing, becoming part of the world they moved through with such natural belonging. As the last wolf disappeared from view, Atreus became aware of a voice calling his name, distant at first, then growing clearer. His father's voice, deep and familiar, pulling him back from this dreamscape toward waking reality. Atreus, the sun rises. We must continue our journey. Atreus opened his eyes to find morning light filtering through the trees above their camp. His father stood nearby, already prepared for travel, his imposing figure silhouetted against the brightening sky. The fire had burned to cold ash, and dew glistened on the surrounding foliage. "I had a dream," Atreus said, sitting up and reaching for his boots. "About wolves. I walked with them through forests and meadows." Kratos regarded his son with those inscrutable eyes that revealed so little, yet saw so much. Dreams often carry wisdom if we have ears to hear it. He turned toward the path that awaited them. Come, the day grows no younger. As Atreus gathered his belongings and prepared to follow his father, he felt something had changed within him. Nothing dramatic or immediately visible, but significant nonetheless. The silent teachings of his dream journey had taken root, altering how he perceived the world around him and his place within it. He paused briefly, looking back at their campsite. In the soft earth near where he had slept, a single track was pressed clearly into the soil. The print of a large wolf's paw, its outline sharp and unmistakable. Atreus smiled, neither surprised nor confused by this impossible track. Some boundaries remained more permeable than others, and wisdom flowed where it was needed, following ancient paths invisible to ordinary sight. The silent pack had shared their teaching, and he would carry it forward, one more thread woven into the tapestry of who he was becoming. "I'm ready," he said, turning to join his father on the trail ahead, moving forward with quiet strength born of belonging to something greater than himself alone. And so our journey through the realms draws to a close for tonight. May Hypnos, god of sleep, watch over you as you drift through dreams of legendary proportions. If these tales of gods and monsters helped guide you to restful sleep, consider supporting our journey by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support gives me the strength to continue sharing these stories night after night. Remember, these videos play uninterrupted through the night, with no ads to disturb your slumber, just the soothing sounds of mythic realms to accompany your dreams. For those seeking passage to exclusive content, our Patreon offers early access to all videos and special playlists crafted to enhance your sleep. The link awaits in the description below. Until our next journey together, may your sleep be deep, your dreams be mighty, and your rest be undisturbed by the conflicts of gods and men. Sleep well, brave one.